Listeners, readers, welcome to the Foxed Page, where we dive deep into the very best books. You'll come away with a richer understanding of the text at hand, all while learning to read everything a little better. I'm Kimberly Ford, one-time adjunct professor, Berkeley best-selling author, and PhD in literature. I am also someone who has read 46 or 47, depending on how you're counting, of the New York Times 100 top books of the 21st century. It was so fun to go through this list. The reason I say 46 and maybe not 47 is one of my kids swears that I did read Jessamine Ward's Sing Unburied Sing, and in fact that I read that book alongside this child, but honestly I have no memory of it, so I didn't count it. If I have literally zero memory of something, I am not going to count it. Those of you who've listened to the Foxed Page for a long time know, in fact, that my memory is not great. And one thing that's interesting about my experience of going through this list of books is the sense of tone that I get and the feeling that I have from these books, which is often very strong, but it's really very, very infrequently tied to any sort of plot. This will not surprise any of you, but it turns out that when I read far more for language than I do for what is happening in the story. And the other thing is a lot of these books are nonfiction, which I have realized that I read much too little of. So here's what we are going to do today. I'm going to whip through these suckers. What I'm going to do is start from book 100 and move quickly all the way up to book number 1. I am going to tell you how this book ranked according to the New York Times. Then I'm going to give it a score from 0 to 10. What's interesting is the few that scored maybe perhaps not quite so high. I'm going to tell you something that I really loved about the book, something I wasn't wild about, and then I maybe, might give you a little something extra about a few of these. We're going to dive right in with a doozy. So their number 100 was Tree of Smoke by Dennis Johnson. I, in fact, gave Tree of Smoke a 3. Train Dreams, a story collection by Dennis Johnson, was their 52. I gave that a 7. I had loved Jesus' Son. In fact, that is what I love best about Dennis Johnson. When I went back and took a look at Tree of Smoke, I got a little tired of the machista, kind of this very overbearing sort of male thing. But I will say, when Tree of Smoke came out, it in fact occasioned a slightly embarrassing chapter for me. Just after I had published my very first short story in the 3-penny review, Wendy Lesser would send books to people who had published recently and ask them to review. So I read Tree of Smoke in its advanced reader copy, and I just absolutely panned it. I wrote the most scathing review, and Wendy Lesser was so bummed out, and she basically was like, okay, I'm not going to ask you to write anymore. I think I was still in academic mode, and I really just ripped into this thing. But I will stand by that. I would be curious to see the number of men versus women who voted these two works by Dennis Johnson into this top 100. Moving on, Bel Canto, it's their book 98. I gave it a 6, which is going to be unpopular with a lot of you all. One thing I really loved about that book was the premise. So there's kind of a writing adage that one of the very best ways to get a lot of tension and a lot of good story is to put a disparate group of people into a small space and apply pressure. So I loved the concept of this. I loved the setting in South America. I really liked a lot about this book, but afterward I had this kind of lingering sense of dissatisfaction. When people would say, what'd you think about Bel Canto? I'd be like, yeah, good, I liked it. So, that's where we land on. That's how we get a 6 in this listing. Moving on to Zadie Smith, who I really like a lot. Her On Beauty was their 94. I gave that a 7. I really liked that book. I also gave a 7 to White Teeth, which was their book 31. I really love Zadie Smith. I love her nonfiction too. There is a very sort of Dickensian field. It's a very rich kind of thing happening. I also really like the fact that she focuses on family. On Beauty has a real academic focus, which I really like. I did not even know. I think it's a rewriting of Howard's End. So I should go back and revisit that because I really do love Zadie Smith. Their book 88 was The Collected Stories of Lydia Davis. I, in fact, gave that a 9. I love Lydia Davis. I do think she gets a lot of credit and a lot of recognition, but she should always get more. The inventiveness of this prose is incredible. I say prose, but it's almost poetry. She's very well known for these very, very short pieces of fiction. It's almost like these kind of Zen koans where, you'll read one and you will continue to think about it, for hours after having read it. Davis herself said that a lot of her work is not meant to be read kind of all in one go, that you really should be reading these in smaller bits, which I really like that as a concept. The Collected Stories of Lydia Davis is something that you should have on your coffee table, and you should pick it up occasionally and just feel completely enlightened and privileged to have Lydia Davis in your life. Hurricane Season by Fernanda Melchor is their 82. I, in fact, gave it a 9. Hurricane Season was honestly one of my very, very favorite books of the past 25 years. I will say that it is so haunting and it was so visceral in terms of a read that I have a hard time really recommending it ardently for people because I found it so upsetting. But that, of course, is the sign of really, really excellent prose. It's an incredible depiction of Mexico. It's such a rich vision into a complicated family. It's an unbelievable, unbelievable book. It's also not very long, which honestly, I think if it were a lot longer, people might just die reading it because it is so powerful and so urgent. Fernanda Melchor, in fact, is known as the Faulkner of the South, which I really loved that because there is a richness. There's also a certain sort of difficulty in reading the text that in some ways feels like Faulkner. Not, in fact, because it is, so dense in terms of the language, but simply because some of the things she is talking about, much like Faulkner, are just really sort of gut-wrenching in the very, very best ways. I will also say I originally read it in Spanish, and then I read the translation. I'm fascinated by translation, and the translation is excellent. The Times Survey gave A Manual for Cleaning Women by Lucia Berlin. That was their number 79. I gave it a 10. This is a collection of short stories that tell some very, very difficult stories with so much humor and so much compassion and so much intelligence. It is just unbelievably great. They almost read, like connected stories. They're just absolutely stunning and so funny and so rich and so smart. And it's actually excellent to be looking at Lucia Berlin right after we've talked about Lydia Davis, because in fact, Lydia Davis wrote the introduction when they reissued all of these stories by Lucia Berlin. They've been incredibly popular, and they should be because they are so excellent. When I'm giving something a 10, I'm going to treat you all to a tiny little excerpt from that work. This is just the one sentence, and in fact, it's what they pulled out in the list. This is the simple kind of genius thing that you get again and again in Lucia Berlin. The quotation is this: "I hate to see anything lovely by myself." Speaks volumes. Incredible, incredible. If you haven't read Lucia Berlin yet, put that at the top of your list. The New York Times book number 76 was Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow by Gabrielle Zevin. I gave it an 8. I loved all of the Shakespearean overtones. I loved the breadth of it. I, in fact, also really loved that it served as sort of a window for me into a generation that I didn't fully understand. I'm thinking here mostly about video games. For some reason, for me, it feels a little bit like a book that is very specific in terms of the time and the era in which it came out. And in some ways, it feels a little bit adolescent, not in a bad way, but in a way that made me feel, would it be in my top 10? Maybe. We'll see, because I will soon come up with my top 10. Haven't done that yet. But it does feel a little bit young in a way that maybe didn't make me feel like it would endure. And I think part of my definition of my top 10 would be something, in fact, that's sort of timeless in some ways. Their book 65 was The Plot Against America by Philip Roth. I gave that book a 7. I've read quite a few books by Philip Roth. I was interested in him. He was supposed to be kind of like this misogynist. And I don't know, Lena Dunham said something about how she loved reading Philip Roth despite all of, his baggage. And I hadn't read any at that point, and I did really enjoy it. But what I loved about this book in particular, and this is unusual for me, is the plot premise. The premise here is the idea of an America that is sliding toward fascism. And, unfortunately, it was sort of prescient in some ways. But I also really, really loved the prose. It's a very poignant, in the best ways of that word, look at, the growing up of a young man in somewhat extraordinary and yet very familiar circumstances. Oh my God, this next one. Their book 63 was Veronica by Mary Gateskill. I gave this an 8. Again, I'm feeling a little more generous this morning when I'm actually sitting down to film this. I feel like I would have given that book a 9 if I were in this mood, apparently. Mary Gateskill is so incredibly good. The way that she writes is so raw and so honest and really unusual. There's a sort of grittiness to it all. I love all of her work, but Veronica really is the one I think that is most accessible and most kind of interesting and frankly a little bit less relentless than the other works. One of the words that they used to describe it was lacerating. And honestly, I feel like that's pretty appropriate, but it is so good. It's a story about two women and their relationship, and it's just unbelievable. Their book 62 is 1004 by Ben Lerner. I gave 1004 a 9. Leaving the Atocha Station was the first book that he wrote, and I honestly liked that one a little bit more. That's a 10. That's a 10 for me. Leaving the Atocha Station and 1004 are written by Ben Lerner, who is a very accessible and really incredible poet, and their writing can feel very brainy and sort of perhaps a little bit overly intellectual, but of course I am a sucker for that. And 1004, it's almost like this auto-fiction that we are getting these days from people like Knausgaard and people like Annie Ernaux, where we have this idea of almost being invited to conflate the author with the narrator. And I loved the fact that Leaving the Atocha Station and 1004, they sort of speak to each other. There's a sort of evolution in those two books. This writing is unusual. It's super brainy, but it's also so warm. And in many ways, you feel like he is so vulnerable. If you were a fan of David Foster Wallace, I feel like Ben Lerner is like, in some ways, kind of like an improved version of David Foster Wallace. Their book 61 was Demon Copperhead. I gave Demon Copperhead an 8. I really, really liked it. Notably, it was number one when, the Gen Pop went ahead and wrote in with their favorites. And I think that is very deserved. First and foremost, I loved the way that this mapped almost perfectly onto David Copperfield. But I also think, of course, it's telling a very important story. David Copperfield was really taking to task the foster system in the UK in much the same way, in fact, that Barbara Kingsolver is taking on the opioid crisis. And I'm not a huge fan of a book that's like kind of trying to teach us something, but in fact, I found that a really important piece of this and something that was very appealing. Their book 59 was Jeffrey Eugenides' Middlesex. I really loved that book when it came out. I have it as an 8 here, in part because it is not a book I have had the urge to go back and reread. It was a book that was very interesting for me at the time, but I found that the prose was not quite as interesting as one of his other books, which is The Virgin Suicides. That was a book whose language really spoke to me in many ways. Middlesex was much more about the idea of an intersex person, together with a really interesting look into this Midwestern family who had emigrated from Greece. I also wonder how this book would hold up. I mean, it was published a long time ago. I don't have the date here. But I think we've really evolved in many ways in terms of looking at gender and in terms of looking at sex. And I would be very curious, although, again, not quite curious enough to go back, hence the 8. We now, at book 53, come to Alice Munro. So number 53 on their list is Runaway. I gave it an 8. Their book 23 was Hate Ship, Love Ship, Courtship, Friendship, Marriage. Oof, I don't think I said that in the right order. That was right off the top of my head. I gave that also an 8. So I look at the work of Alice Munro kind of as a whole. And those of you who listened to my lecture on Lives of Girls and Women, or the look at Alice Munro's short fiction, know that this was not a writer who really spoke to me when I very first encountered her when I was 18 years old. But she is someone who has really grown on me, perhaps because I can now appreciate lines like this. You cannot let your parents anywhere near your real humiliations. I don't even know why I didn't love her in the beginning, but there's lots and lots of just absolutely genius remarks like that. I think that she transfers the world into prose in a way that is unique and in a way that is incredibly telling and really can shift some of your ideas about very fundamental things like relationships among people. We have learned recently that when one of Alice Munro's daughters came to her to tell her about sexual abuse that this young girl was suffering at the hands of Alice Munro's husband, Alice Munro, in fact, kept that information secret and did not, in fact, help her daughter. It's a painful thing of thinking about this, but one I think that needs to be acknowledged as we are moving through. But in many ways, the bottom line is that the prose is unbelievably great. The New York Times book number 51 was Life After Life by Kate Atkinson. I gave this book a 7. What I liked most is it was sort of formally inventive. This is a book that has many different endings. I mean, this kind of life after life gives you a sense of that. But my impression of it was that maybe the language and the prose wasn't quite engaging enough for me to want to go back and read it. And it is not a book, in fact, that I was, recommending to everyone. But in terms of formal invention, I remember it being really interesting. Their book 50 was Trust by Hernan Diaz. So I recently did a lecture on that. It is one that I picked up and put back down. Wasn't really gripped by the beginning of that book. And in fact, I now know why. It's a book that rewards really pushing through. But I'm not someone who really loves to push through. And I stand by the fact that the first 2/3 of the book are very off-putting in terms of chauvinism and in terms of some prose that feels very wooden at times. The thing I liked about it most is that it really did acknowledge that women were in fact much more important in the machinations of the 1920s in the United States. It also is a real skewering in some ways of the kind of excessive wealth that was garnered in that era. It's novel and it's interesting. It was really fun to dig into and really fun to analyze, but it is not one, in fact, that I'm dying to go back to, hence the 7. The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt is the New York Times number 40. It was a 4 for me. That's going to be unpopular, but it was a very specific thing that happened for me. There were a couple of different times where I didn't buy it. You know, this 15-year-old boy who is at the center of the Goldfinch, he's in this like Las Vegas flophouse and he is reciting by heart the Red Badge of Courage, which is just something that I just don't buy. I mean, there are lots of things that I can imagine a 15-year-old boy in a flophouse in Las Vegas reciting, but the Red Badge of Courage is not one of them. There was also something about antiques that I just remember being like, I think this is bullshit. I don't buy it. And whether or not, in fact, those things are possible doesn't really matter, because there was something in the prose, there was something in the book that made me feel like I don't believe this. And the problem is, as soon as a writer does a couple of things that make you sort of step out of the story and you're like, wait, I don't really buy that this could be unfolding in this way, then you start becoming a little skeptical, which is in some ways for me the kiss of death. The next book they picked, though, number 45, was The Argonauts by Maggie Nelson. This is, it's a 9. It's a 9 here. The Argonauts is unbelievable. It is a memoir. As I mentioned before, I read precious little nonfiction, and mostly what I read, if not all that I read in nonfiction, is memoir. This was a book that was so incredible. In many ways, it defies genre. It is a memoir, but there is also a very novelistic feel. I loved the focus on women. I loved the focus on pregnancy, on desire, on love. It was just an absolutely incredible book. It's very heady and very sort of thought-provoking in many ways, but just absolutely gorgeous. It's also a very skinny little book, which is incredible because it deserves rereading and rereading and rereading. Their 41 was Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan. I loved this book so much, gave it a 10. And it is not only because Cillian Murphy is going to star in the adaptation, although let me tell you, I'm very excited about Cillian Murphy bringing to life these books by Claire Keegan. I really loved Foster as well, but Small Things Like These had a certain breadth to it that was just unbelievable. The thing that I like very, very best about Claire Keegan is that every single word in every single one of her novellas is so weight-bearing, in the sense that every single image, every single word is so meaningful. You can open up to any phrase in any one of these, and you could analyze it for hours and hours, because they are so rich and they are so thoughtful and they are so full of figurative language that is telling and instructive and interesting. I think Claire Keegan is really unparalleled in many ways, and I can tell you that for certain this book will be in my top 10. The next book, also, however, we're on a little bit of a roller coaster at this point in the list, is book 39, A Visit from the Goon Squad by Jennifer Egan. I have this as a 6. I really wanted to love Jennifer Egan's work. I have all these New Yorkers stacked up, and of course I never read them. But one of the stories that I read by Jennifer Egan, I can't remember the name of it, but it took place in the Mediterranean. It was really wanted to love all of Jennifer Egan, and for some reason I'm always left a bit cold. I liked the idea that this felt sort of, there were many voices. I should have liked, this kind of focus on, this kind of Gen X kind of situation, but for some reason it just felt a little thin. It just, most of her work does a little bit. Sorry, Jennifer Egan. The next book, number 38, is Roberto Bolaño's The Savage Detectives. So this is a book that I really loved. I gave it an 8. The reason I gave it an 8 is because it felt like a little bit name droppy. I did read it in Spanish, and I'm not exactly sure what the translation looks like. This is a very long book, so it is not one that I read the translation of right away. I really loved a bunch of the cameos by actual Mexican poets. I really loved the kind of rarefied literary feel. But I think at times, we're about to get very literary here. At times, it felt to me like kind of a poor man's Rayuela. Rayuela was a book by Julio Cortázar. that is called Hopscotch in English, and it is a book that you can read. You can move from any section to any section. It's very long and has very short chapters for the most part, and you can read in any sequence you want. And it was just an absolute revelation to me during graduate school. So The Savage Detectives, a lot was made of the sort of parallels between those two books. So I did read it with Rayuela in mind, and that might have been a mistake because it did not quite measure up for me. But I'm really happy that Bolaño made this list because, in fact, his work is incredible. I also was really interested in the fact that 2666, which is another one of his big behemoths of a doorstop, that made the popular list. That made the list of the people, which I was very, I was happy. I was happy to be part of the people that, in fact, would raise up 2666 to put it in their top 100. Oh, speaking of translation, we are moving to book number 37, which is The Years by Annie Ernaux. I was so happy to see this. I gave this book an 8, but honestly, the rest of her work, I would give either a 9 or a 10. I have long loved Annie Ernaux, and I was so happy when she won the Nobel. She has this prose that is so stripped down and is so transparent in many ways, but so much of the writing just really cuts to the bone. I mean, it is just absolutely incredible. And I really love, too, the way that it does feel like autofiction. Annie Ernaux is one of these people who is not particularly concerned with genre and not particularly concerned with the line between memoir and fiction. So this writing ends up feeling like you have this incredible vision of her mother and of her father and of the town that she grew up in, Rouen, which is in France, which for those of you who are fans of Madame Bovary, you will recognize that name. It's really interesting to look at Madame Bovary, which is set in Normandy, in the exact same town where Annie Ernaux is writing all of these slim, delicious books, 100 years later. So I was so happy that this book was here, but I was also a bit surprised because The Years, it has a lot of cultural references to France. I did, in fact, a lecture on it, and I said this, and I think it's very telling, which is that I was like, there's so many popular references, for sure I'm just going to end up skimming through some of this stuff, and I never did, never skimmed. Even when they were references that I did not understand at all, it was so compelling and so interesting just to listen to her writing, and I was very happy that she came in at number 37. Oh gosh. The next book, it's their 36. I gave this a 9. I'm feeling very expansive today. I feel like now it deserves a 10. This is Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. He wrote also The Beautiful Struggle, which is a memoir of his youth. And then this is sort of an extension of that. It's an absolutely beautiful memoir. It's an incredible piece of literature. He's writing in sort of the legacy of James Baldwin. And the idea of the book is that he is writing a letter to his son about what it is to be a Black man in America. You all know that I don't remember books that I read particularly well. This is a book that I have so many images from it. And the idea of Prince Jones, this is a character who becomes somewhat large throughout the course of this incredible book, Between the World and Me. And I just was absolutely wrenched. Just it's such an affecting and such a moving and such an absolutely beautiful piece of writing. If you haven't read these memoirs by Ta-Nehisi Coates, you absolutely must. They are so important and urgent and affirming and just absolutely beautiful pieces of writing. Then we move on to number 35, which is Fun Home by Alison Bechdel. I gave this an 8. Again, I think it deserves a 9. I loved this book. Alison Bechdel writes graphic novels, which are totally not my thing. I find myself distracted by the drawings. Like I see these things and I'm like trying to just like read the little bubbles, read the language there. And often the font is kind of wacky and then that gets to me. But I will read any graphic novel by Alison Bechdel. In fact, I read one that she did about exercise, which is like not really my bag. I don't even remember the title now, but I really loved even that, even her writing about like, I don't know, exercise. The first of these, Fun Home, is this incredibly psychoanalytic look at her father. This is a memoir, and it's an absolutely incredible look at not only at her relationship with her father and his experience of coming out as gay, but also just like the ways that families function. The second book that I loved by her, the second graphic novel, is Are You My Mother?, which I was so happy that a lot of the psychoanalytic stuff that came up in the first book continued into the second book. And I was so delighted by the idea of having this vision of her father and then having the vision of the mother. It was so satisfying. Okay, number 33 is Salvage the Bones by Jessamine Ward. I mentioned earlier that one of my kids was absolutely certain that I read Sing Unburied Sing alongside this kid. I have absolutely no memory of that. But I have lots and lots of memories of Salvage the Bones. It is a rewriting of Medea, the Greek story of Medea, and I loved that. And it was incredibly important to me too. Did I even mention what I gave it? What did I give it? I gave it a, oh my God, it says here I gave it a 6. I definitely didn't give it a 6, but I'll tell you why. It really deserves like an 8 because it's a very important story, and I loved hearing about the aftermath of Katrina from, the viewpoint of a 13-year-old girl. It was so important. The reason I gave it a 6 here, I must have been in like a little bit of a bad mood when I was first going through this and giving my rankings. But the reason I did is because Jessamine Ward has called herself, in fact, a failed poet. And throughout her work, there is quite a bit of figurative language, lots of metaphor, lots of simile, and in fact, a lot of them did not work for me. And I found it so distracting. So I think the 6 came just from the fact that there were just some really gonzo kind of metaphors and similes here that I just was like, why? You don't have to use metaphor and simile. Just like go for it. Just tell us about Medea, tell us about Katrina, just go. Because the writing is so good, but then we would have these metaphors and similes that really took me out of the story. But I really don't think it deserves a 6. The next, There 27, is Americana by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. I have it down here as an 8. That seems about right. I was absolutely transported in this book to worlds that were so unfamiliar to me, and my eyes were so opened. The descriptions were rich and interesting, but not belabored. I really, really felt like this was great. There 26 is Atonement by Ian McEwan. I gave it an 8. I really like this book. I mean, what I have here in my notes is that I was actually surprised that this was published in the 21st century. It seems like an older book than that. In many ways, it just felt like good old-fashioned storytelling. I love Ian McEwan. I love, I think the Second World War is this very important and, in fact, very rich kind of fodder. I mean, I hate to reduce the war to the idea of fodder for literature, but I do think there is an enormous amount of tension and really important questions that arise from any war, and that was such a touch point. But again, what I think I loved most about it was, in fact, it just felt like a good old-fashioned novel. Oh gosh, the next book is The Overstory by Richard Powers. So this is their 24. I gave it a 6. And even now, I kind of feel like that might have been a little generous. I will tell you, I read, I think The Goldbug Variations was a Richard Powers novel, or Gain, maybe Gain was the one, where I finally realized that what bothered me so much about Richard Powers is, in fact, that his dialogue is not great. And when I say not great, I kind of mean terrible. I, in fact, had a writing teacher, and I was like, I think the thing with Richard Powers for me is that the dialogue is not great. And this is a very well-known person. You have all heard of him. He's really an incredibly bright and also an incredible literary heavyweight. And he was like, oh yeah, he's got no ear at all. I mean, I don't mean to just be shitting on Richard Powers, but if we have an aspect of a novelist's work that we already know we're not wild about, and then in fact that idea is reinforced, I find it difficult to sometimes look past these things that are in fact fairly pervasive throughout a novel. And in this case, I just couldn't do it. I really wanted to love this because in fact, this book was occasioned by the time that Richard Powers came out and he was at Stanford. And, the story has it that he was experiencing the California redwoods for the first time. So I was like, okay, this is going to be the book. I'm going to be able to look past the dialogue and I'm going to really love these redwoods of my youth. I mean, these redwoods, we have them, in our house, not in our house, but you know what I mean? They're incredibly important, and I'm really into trees right now in general. And I still did not love it. Hence the 6. Okay, we are now moving on to George Saunders. Pastoralia was their 85, and Lincoln in the Bardo was their 18. Pastoralia and all of George Saunders' short work, I'm going to give an 8 too. I find it a little bit uneven. One of my favorite works of his, I love it so much, is The Brief and Frightening Reign of Phil. Unbelievably great. Just it's a very short little novella. It's deceivingly simple, but is also a very important story about the rise of fascism. It is unbelievably great. But what I love about his work is what everybody else loves about his work. There's a warmth, but also a crazy perversion and sort of a derangement to some of it. It's inventive and wild and raw. And I can't say that I love all of the stories equally, but some of them are the best short fiction that I've ever read in my life. Now, moving on to Lincoln in the Bardo. This was a 10. It's honestly a book that I have thought so much about. It is one that I push on everyone. It's not the easiest of books because, in fact, the structure is really interesting. And of course, I loved that. So it's challenging in many ways. And I was so happy to see that it was number 18 on this list. It's just unbelievably great. It's also a very interesting audio version. There are many different voices in the novel. And in fact, when they do the audio version, it's one of these kind of more highly produced ones, which sometimes can be annoying, but I found this interesting and revealing in lots of ways. There are also lots of like celebrities in there. I think everybody was probably clamoring to be in George Saunders' book, and one of the roles is taken by his mother, which I loved. There's a lot of Buddhist stuff. Obviously, Lincoln in the Bardo. The Bardo is a Buddhist concept. This idea of a period of time after you are dead, but you sort of remain in your terrestrial setting for a period of time. But there are Buddhist overtones through a lot of George Saunders' work, and I just find them irresistible. Because it is one of my 10s, and there are very few, I wanted to treat you to a little bit. I loved what the reviewer, what the quotation thing that was pulled out by one of the people who voted. This is about the short fiction, but I felt like this was such a great description. He said, Saunders has cultivated a genuinely original voice, one that is hilarious and profound, tender and monstrous, otherworldly and deeply familiar, much like the American psyche itself. I love monstrous. I love otherworldly and deeply familiar. This is such a good description of Saunders. I obviously couldn't have done better myself, which is why I read it. I also, though, want to give a little more time to Lincoln in the Bardo. I have such strong memories of that book, and you all know that I don't really remember books particularly well. I have such a strong vision of the Lincoln character, taking his son onto his lap. I have such a haunting impression of that party, and it has those spun sugar ships, and there's all this description of the sort of abundance, but it's like a slightly creepy description of the abundance, and all of this party that is happening on the night when this child is dying. It's just, those are like tip of the iceberg things, but when a scene sticks with me like that over, I don't remember when this book was published, but it was a long time ago, and those, it's like, it's as if I read them yesterday. I want to read a tiny excerpt because George Saunders is so incredible, and honestly, we should treat ourselves to his work all the time. This is the Lincoln character thinking about his son. He came out of nothingness, took form, was loved, was always bound to return to nothingness. Only I did not think it would be so soon, or that he would precede us. Two passing temporarinesses developed feelings for one another. Two puffs of smoke became mutually fond. I mistook him for a solidity, and now must pay. I am not stable, and Mary not stable, and the very buildings and monuments here not stable, and the greater city not stable, and the wide world not stable. After all alter, are altering in every instant. Are you comforted? No. It's just, this is a very Buddhist concept as well, but it's just this idea of two puffs become mutually fond. It's just, I just find it absolutely so beautiful. So I am so happy, frankly, that George Saunders is alive and is writing, and that I am getting to witness it. I feel like a puff that is mutually fond of his puff. And I was very happy that two of his works were on here, and that Lincoln in the Bardo is really recognized for the incredible piece of literature that it is. Oh my God, I also just forgot that 10th of December is their number 54. I also gave that an 8. Again, I give all of the short fiction an 8, and Lincoln in the Bardo a 10. The Sellout by Paul Beatty is their number 17. I gave it a 9. I loved this book so much. In fact, I gave a lecture on it when we were in the bookstore, and I will in fact be reprising that lecture because this book is unbelievable. It is so funny, but also so dark. It's inventive. It's interesting. It takes place in Los Angeles, but kind of this rarefied Los Angeles that's just unbelievable. It is a real deep dive into race and class and what it is to be human. That sounds so cliche, but it is a book that makes you feel like it is tackling all of those and doing it incredibly well. This was a book that I pushed on everyone at the time, and I was so happy that it came in at their number 17. It's an unbelievable book. Their 16 was The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay. I gave that book an 8. I read it when it first came out. This was at a time, I think, when I was really trying to figure out men. This was when I was really deep into reading a lot of books by very kind of male authors. And this one, in fact, really opened my eyes to a very male, I think, world, which is the world of comic books. There's a lot in here about the underdog. There's a lot in here about what it is to be Jewish. I really, really loved this book. I don't remember much about it. It's long, and I remember really loving immersing myself in it. So I'm feeling very good about having given it an 8. Did I say that earlier? Yes, I gave it an 8. Okay, number 14 in their list is Outline by Rachel Cusk. So this is a trilogy that I read and was left a bit cold, but it is one that I am going to go back to. I remember being kind of fascinated, but also just like a little bit like, I gave them a 7 because in fact I remember being fascinated by this kind of stripped down and very sort of flat narrator in many ways, but one that's talking about very intriguing situations in a very sort of strange and novel kind of narrative voice. Oh my God. Number 13 is The Road by Cormac McCarthy. I gave this a 9. I love Cormac McCarthy. Some of you maybe have listened to the lecture that I did on The Passenger and Stella Maris. I loved those because in many ways it is a woman who is coming to the fore for, I think, kind of the first time in McCarthy. But The Road, I mean, it was so compelling. I read it really quickly, partially because it was so painful. And there are so many things that stand out for me. I just have this like eerie, terrible memory of him, like after the thing happens, which it's, this sort of like undefined apocalyptic event. And he starts turning the water on in the bathtub. And I was like, oh God, like, again, it felt very familiar in many ways, but also just so eerie and so terrible. I was also very interested in the absence of the mother here. She makes a decision early on, in fact, to take her own life because she foresees how difficult this is going to be. It was a decision that I'd like to think more about. In fact, I've become more and more convinced that perhaps McCarthy is just sort of like pushing women out in order to really dig in to these relationships between men. But I also reasoned when I was thinking this through, that he could have just had this be a single father and a son. He also could have had the wife die, in some sort of other way very quickly, perhaps because of this apocalyptic event or even instantaneously. And he does not do that. In fact, he chooses to have a mother figure who, for all intents and purposes, sort of abandons the family. So I was very fixated on that in some ways, but also just absolutely so moved and just like, and it is another one of these books, a little bit like Hurricane Season, where I just don't know that I can ever go back and reread it because I found it so deeply affecting. Their number 12, a book that I gave a 9 to, is The Year of Magical Thinking by Joan Didion. So again, I don't read a lot of nonfiction, but hers is a nonfiction body of work that I actually know very well. I love her nonfiction voice. I love all of her essays. I also, though, kind of first and foremost think of her as a novelist. So when all of these series of tragedies befell her, her husband died, her daughter got very sick, and then her daughter died, it was like I was watching this happen to someone who I felt like I knew well, and I do not think I was the only one. Joan Didion has this kind of ardent and very devoted and very long-standing fan base that in fact spans generations. And I think many, many people, many among them women, really identified in many ways with the trajectory of her life. So it was absolutely harrowing to have the experience of her grief upon the death of her husband be written down in such haunting and sort of familiar and well-worn and just absolutely beautiful terms. I really remember this part that she didn't want to give away her husband John's shoes because she had the sense that like when he got back, he was going to need them. And that is the sort of thing that in fact went on to inform my grief in some ways after my mother died. Because in fact, my experience of grief is that it ambushes you at these weird times and that you have these kind of strange thoughts that you obviously never thought you were going to have. And it was very comforting, in fact, to have her book, not as a roadmap in any sense, but it was one that I thought about a lot. I also was really taken by the cover. If you never noticed this, it's worth taking a look at. When it says The Year of Magical Thinking, it's just those letters that are kind of spaced out. They're all uppercase, and it's a beautiful font. But if you look a little more carefully, the letters John are a different color. So you have the idea of her husband, John, as being somewhat hidden in this Year of Magical Thinking. It's one of my favorite covers ever. I thought it was so intelligent. Go back and take a look because it's an unbelievable cover. Their book number 11 was The Brief and Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde. I gave that a 9. I love Junot Diaz. I love his short fiction. It's gritty. It's funny. I found the voice just really, really compelling. And I liked the ways in some way that the person who we sort of see as the narrator in some of his short fictions seems to enter into Oscar Wilde. This is another one that had a lot to do with comic books. And it's, again, very much the story of this underdog. And I liked the way, in fact, that in some ways this main character was awkward and it theoretically might have been difficult to relate to him because he is so different from my life. And yet I really felt invested. I also really loved the presence of the women in the family, his mother and his sister. It just was a book I loved. It is a book that I was pushing on everyone at the time. I did a lecture on it at the bookstore. It's just an unbelievably rich and interesting and compelling novel. The Times #8 book was Austerlitz by W.G. Sebald. I gave it a 7. I went through a Sebald like phase for a little while there, read all of his work, and in fact it has all kind of mushed together in my mind. I remember feeling like it reads very much like memoir. I think he's one of these people who is playing with this notion of the line, in fact, between sort of nonfiction and fiction, or at least in the idea of writing fiction that feels very memoiresque and that is in fact very tied to certain things that happened in the real world. I also absolutely love his use of photographs. So this is something that distinguished him and continues to distinguish him in my mind from every other writer. So even in paperback copies, just set into the text at different points, you'll have these photographic images that are so fascinating. They tend to be a little orthogonal. It's not like, he's describing someone and then there's a photograph of that person. They tend to be images that make you think a bit because they don't seem very obvious. I love the breadth that it gave, and it was unexpected and interesting. And in fact, I kept thinking like, oh God, he's going to start this trend where now everyone is going to be having these different images in their work. And in fact, that didn't happen. And I sort of love that. There are some images in North Woods by Daniel Mason. I was very happy to see that book made it into the top 100 list of the general readership of the regular population. And that is one that has some images in it that are really interesting. Okay, their #7 was The Underground Railroad by Colson Whitehead. I gave it a 6, which is, again, going to be very unpopular. I loved The Intuitionist, which was a book by Colson Whitehead. And so I was really excited about The Underground Railroad. I think the thing that was problematic for me was the kind of speculative nature of it, this sort of trope or the sort of premise that in fact it was, this actual railroad that would deliver people. I'm not even sure that's it. Sometimes it's just not clear to me why a book doesn't speak to me. But again, this was one I wanted to really love, and I've tried it a couple times now. I have to say I have not finished it. So maybe for some people that kind of disqualifies my opinion. But I don't believe in finishing books that you are not into. I just don't. There's too much good stuff out there to read. Oh my God, though, the next books, Hilary Mantel. I was so happy to see 2 of her works on this list. At number 95, it was Bring Up the Bodies. I gave it a number 8. And Wolf Hall was their number 3 book, and I gave that a 9. I loved these books so much. In fact, it should be a 10. I loved these books. I am not a historical fiction fan, generally speaking, because it tends to feel kind of like people are kind of trying too hard. Although Maggie O'Farrell, man, that Hamnet, wow, that was an amazing, amazing piece of historical fiction. As you know, these books are really long, and I busted through all of them. And then I also read that other one that was about the French Revolution, like Another Place of Peace or something. I loved all of her work. I loved it so much. I was just so happy to see it on this list. The Times #3 book is The Corrections by Jonathan Franzen. I gave it a 7. I liked it. Fine. In my mind, for some reason, it has completely been taken over by This Is Where I Leave You. And not just the novel, it has been taken over by the movie. When I think of The Corrections, I just go straight to like Jane Fonda and who else is in that? I can't remember right now. Maybe Jason Bateman. Anyway, in my mind, The Corrections has been completely eclipsed. I liked it, and I liked Jonathan Franzen fine. I don't even remember the name of the novel that I tried most recently. I mean, now I'm just kind of shitting on Jonathan Franzen, but I think he's fine. Then we are moving on to the #1 book on the New York Times list, My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante. I have to say, I loved the fact that they started with 100 and that they were scrolling, and that they were releasing these things by the week. I mean, I was really getting into this whole thing. And there was so much suspense for me about what this #1 book would be. I'm not someone who is strategic or very forward thinking, so I didn't try to speculate. I was just going to be like surprised by it. And in fact, I just almost died. I think I literally went, what? Like, I think that's probably what I did when I looked at it. I did not love this book. I did not love the trilogy. I really, really love The Lost Daughter by Elena Ferrante, but the Neapolitan cycle, it left me so cold because, in fact, this was the number one book. I wanted to read the very beginning of it, and then I wanted to read the very beginning of The Lost Daughter, just to give you a little sense of the difference of the prose. I mean, when I went back and looked at it after I saw this, I was like, I think I'm justified. This book is leaving me cold. So this is the opening of My Brilliant Friend. This morning, Reno telephoned. I thought he wanted money again, and I was ready to say no. But that was not the reason for the phone call. His mother was gone. Since when? Since 2 weeks ago. And you're calling me now? My tone must have seemed hostile, even though I wasn't angry or offended. There was just a touch of sarcasm. He tried to respond, but he did so in an awkward, muddled way, half in dialect, half in Italian. He said he was sure that his mother was wandering around Naples as usual. Guys, this is the opening to this book. I mean, I'm not trying to dissuade anyone who really loved this book, but I'm trying to figure out, in fact, why it really did not sit that well with me. So even in this little thing here, we've got a lot of telling. We've got this opening that feels very flat for me. I mean, it's all about this phone call, and then he's like, she's probably just wandering around Naples. It felt very anticlimactic. Not even that I really need something to feel climactic. The dialogue feels flat. This idea here, my tone must have seemed hostile, even though I wasn't angry or offended. There was just a touch of sarcasm. No one should ever have to describe their dialogue. The dialogue should speak for itself. I mean, this is I don't even know. I'm not going to go into it much further because I just will get my blood pressure going. Here, though, is the first paragraph of The Lost Daughter. I did a lecture on it early on, but honestly, the sound was so bad that I think I'm going to have to go back and re-record it. I really loved that book. It was tense and interesting. Little did I know it was almost like a horror story, but the best kind of horror story. Here's the opening of The Lost Daughter. I had been driving for less than an hour when I began to feel ill. The burning in my side came back, but at first I decided not to give it any importance. I became worried only when I realized I no longer had the strength to hold on to the steering wheel. In the space of a few minutes, my head became heavy, the headlights grew dimmer. Soon I even forgot that I was driving. I had the impression, rather, of being at the sea in the middle of the day. The beach was empty, the water calm, but on a pole a few meters from shore a red flag was waving. When I was a child, my mother had frightened me, saying, "Lita, you must never go swimming if you see a red flag. It means the sea is rough and you might drown." That fear had endured through the years and even now. I mean, that is a hell of an opening. First of all, the name Lita, we've got the idea of Lita and the Swan. We have the idea of rape, in fact, right from the start. It's a very taut beginning. She's driving. There's something wrong. She has a pain in her side. That's very intriguing. It also turns out, once we finish the book, that this is a very circular thing, that what is happening at the beginning of the book is, in fact, sort of the conclusion of what is happening at the end. It's so well done. It's so interesting. We also have this incredible slippage where she's driving, but then she's on the beach, and then you have the red flag warning, which is, making us all feel very taut. Then we have the introduction of the mother here, and the mother warning her that she might drown. I mean, this is a very ominous, really intriguing, very interesting start for me. So it's not that I hate Elena Ferrante, although I have to say I don't have a lot of patience for all this mystery about how this is a pen name and we don't know who the person is. I mean, although we were just talking yesterday, it would be insane if suddenly it were a man who came out and was like, "I am Elena Ferrante." Because, in fact, these books, I think, are, at least the Neapolitan trilogy, I only read the first one, but it was, it was a very striking depiction of friends and rivalrous friends and old friends. So I think it would be actually interesting if it were written by a man. I mean, not to get really binary here and not to really believe in male fiction and female fiction, but I would, in fact, be surprised. I think everybody might be a little surprised. But I didn't have a lot of patience for all of that, rigmarole about the pen name and who she might, in fact, be. But I have to say, I was super disappointed. I got to that number one, and I just was like, whew. But I was also very happy to see that Demon Copperhead was number one on the general population poll. That, to me, is a much more satisfying number one. And I'm going to close with the idea that, of course, the idea of listing these books, the idea of trying to decide what the best books are. I mean, even the Times was very squishy about that. They let people decide the best books in any way they wanted. It could be their favorite book, the one that they thought was most enduring, the one that they thought was best written. So, these things are all very kind of arbitrary. But I found so much joy was to be had in just looking through these things and waiting each week. So I hope that my thoughts on my 46 books /47 has been somewhat interesting. And stay tuned not only for the top 10 that I would have selected if they had asked me, but also for some lectures on these titles. Because in fact, I think a lot of this are looking at this as a sort of reading list. And who doesn't love a good syllabus? I'm going to leave it at that. Thank you so much for listening. Happy reading.